Let us remember we're in the holy presence of God. Saint Faustina, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever. I'm so delighted to be here. My name is Father Bonaventure. We'll get this worked out at some point there. I'm happy to be here. We ordained 10 Dominican friars earlier today and at the Basilica, and the rest of the people are out partying right now, but I'm here, and I couldn't be happier. There's no place I'd rather be than talking about St. Faustina and having the opportunity to share about her, because I love her so much. But that might be strange. This is an interesting mic, isn't it? That might be strange because Dominicans generally aren't, here in this pulpit for these sort of evenings, I suppose. I know Father Jonathan Kalish was here a couple times, and shout out to him if he's listening. He was here for the ordination. But in general, Dominicans are not really Faustina friars, you could say. Now, there's reasons for that, and you can ask in the Q&A why that might be. So it might be strange that I'm here because I'm a Dominican. Secondly, I spend most of my time doing philosophy on Immanuel Kant, or studying Immanuel Kant. And Kant's philosophy, at least moral philosophy, is not really a merciful one, you could say. The categorical imperative doesn't lend itself to much forgiveness, you could say. So that's another reason it might be strange to hear me talk about Faustina and on obedience. But although most Dominicans might not love her, and although Kant wouldn't love her, I do. I love Faustina. But I think more importantly, she loves me. She loves me. She loved me first, it seemed. See, I didn't grow up as a Catholic, but I did grow up in a Polish town. I'm from Buffalo, New York. And when I was in high school, I remember it very vividly, our family always went. I'm a Dominican, so we came from a book family. We went to Barnes & Noble, and we would look at books, and we look in the sections, and I was always drawn to the religious section, you could say. And on the end cap, I remember this, I can still see it. On the end cap, there was this red and white book at the edge of that thing. It looked like this. And I didn't know what this was, but I was drawn to it, partly because I'm colorblind, I suspect, and red, black, and white is good. So remember, the sisters are wearing pink to me. They said gray, but it's not true. It's pink to me. In any case, I was drawn to this book. And I looked at it, and I was a Protestant at the time, planning to go off to seminary to be a Protestant minister. And so the minute I saw it, a nun. Oh, okay, well, stay away. Catholic nuns sort of things. All right? And I thought that would be the end of it. I was okay, that sort of thing. Of course, into my studies in seminary when I was over in England, I had converted to the Catholic faith right before becoming a deacon. And when I came back, before I entered the Dominicans, I was working part-time at that same bookstore, actually, Barnes & Noble. And I went back, and I saw on the end cap, there she was again, on the end cap. And I went up to her, and I said, oh, right. Well, I'm a Catholic now, and so I looked at it, and I said, this is great. Okay, this is fine. I feel comfortable with this. But then I started looking at it, well, it's about a nun. What do I have to do with the Polish nun? So I looked at it, I was comfortable, put it down, though, sort of thing. Then I entered novitiate. So it's our kind of like boot camp. We learn how to wear this and eat spaghetti with a habit on and speak Latin and these sort of things. It's really tricky. Confession, I was wearing a different habit about 2 hours ago before spaghetti dinner. But some things just takes a while to learn. And when we were there, I realized there were a number of, most of the Dominican novices, they had like spiritual, girlfriends, mystics they were reading. St. Catherine of Siena was one. Or Elizabeth of the Trinity, or St. Therese of Lisieux. Everyone seemed to have this kind of female mystic, because women mystics, for reasons you can ask me again, I think just get things a little better sometimes. And I didn't have anyone as a Protestant. I didn't know, sort of thing. And then it hit me. Well, maybe Faustina. Maybe that's why all those times back. And so I started to pray to her, and then just at about the same time, perhaps my best friend in the order, Father Gregory Pine, is a classmate of mine, he just gave me this card, this relic, Faustina on it, and it has in the back a little prayer to her. And I prayed with this card, and I do pray this card every day. I keep it in my pocket, and I ask Faustina to make me a good and holy Dominican priest. She has wandered away at certain times, like I lost her for like 3 weeks at one point, and then I always find, she always comes back to me. And so we have silence in the third floor of the Dominican House of Studies. So you're not allowed to say anything. But when I found her after 3 weeks, I just marched through the hall holding her up, not saying anything, but everyone knew. Everyone should know. So that's to say that Faustina, I love her very much because I think she loved me. I think saints usually choose us. When I'm preparing people for confirmation about saints' names, I often tell them, just pay open attention, pay attention. They might be looking at you. And I think Faustina has been doing that for me, and so I'm always extremely grateful. My priesthood and my Catholic life, I think I dedicate to her. So it's always a great chance to share. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to give a talk or something. So that's what I'm going to do for this next part. Smooth transition. Okay. The title of the talk is A Faustinian Bargain, St. Faustina on Obedience. And I suspect you'll have caught the sort of, well, hopefully the literary allusion there, right? For I want to set my discussion of St. Faustina and on obedience in comparison with Faust and the legend of Faust, the Faustian bargain versus the Faustinian bargain. Faust, of course, the legend most famously known probably through Goethe, right? And I claim that St. Faustina's account of obedience is the opposite of the Faustian legend. So the Faustinian bargain is the opposite of the Faustian bargain. Hence the Faustinian bargain. But let's remind ourselves quickly what the Faustian bargain is first, before coming to Faustina's offer. Simplified to its legendary extremes, a Faustian bargain is the offering of a sacrificing spiritual goods for material goods. Right? The legend comes in different forms, but basically there's this man, Dr. Faustus, who is seeking knowledge and power in the world, and he makes a deal with the devil, Mephistopheles, literally hater of light, in which Faust is given power and knowledge, but only at the cost of damnation of his soul later, at the end of his life. As it turns out, of course, the material gain of knowledge and power is only seeming material gain. And the legend, including Goethe's version of it, becomes one of struggle between Faust and the devil, as things do not go perfectly in his life, even with his new powers. I won't spoil things. You at this point get enough of the idea of the bargain, I suspect, if you didn't know it before. Now, simplified to its saintly extremes, a Faustinian bargain is the sacrificing of seeming material goods for spiritual goods, the opposite. It is roughly the opposite of the Faustian bargain, although the attentive listener may have noticed an important difference between those two, and I'll return to it, and you might rewind it. Accordingly to Faustina's bargain, one sacrifices here and now for the eternal, taking on something burdensome now for something wonderful then. What is the bargaining chip in Faustina's bargain? Obedience. One takes on obedience here and now, seemingly burdensome, for eternal life then and there. And obedience, I suspect, for most of us, unless you're German, in DNA or in heart, is something of a burden, something that is burdensome. We free people of the modern Western world don't like the word very much. If you're American, which I assume most of us here are, although exceptional exceptions, of course, the word even has a sort of un-American ring to it. You know, if this was the 50s, McCarthy would be after you about saying it. We were, after all, founded in the forge of unshackling ourselves from monarchic obedience in England, right? King George III. But moving from the historical to the personal, I think we all find obedience as a sort of negative phenomenon. Most people aren't excited about the prospect of doing something out of obedience. It is a constraint, a matter of lacking or taking away from something, a matter of negation or sacrifice. This is most obvious in the case of obedience to laws. For most of us, I think, perceive laws as a sort of imposition on our freedom, like caging it. They limit us from doing what we want. Household rules work the same way. When we are obedient to the government, our parents, our superiors, etc., we are taking something away from us. We're sacrificing something for something else. And we do this because, well, I don't know. Why do you obey the law? I suspect that you have a reason for it. When it's 6 a.m. out on Michigan Ave, and you are waiting to cross that interminably long crosswalk light near that Starbucks, and you are waiting to cross it, even though there's no car in sight, why do you, if you do, wait for the light to change? My guess is that if you do, the answer is something like this: well, I don't want to get caught or punished. So that you are avoiding something in the future by sacrificing some freedom now, the ability to cross the street early. Thus, obedience is a matter of giving up something, current freedom, for, well, at least giving up non-freedom later. And you might think that this is what religious obedience is, the vow of obedience that we religious take, or just the virtue of obedience to the laws of God for those of us in general, why we obey God's commandments out of obedience. The current sacrificing of our wills now for some future gain. Sounds like a bargain in a way, if you like what's in the future. A sort of banking strategy, since God's interest rates are pretty darn good, it seems. Much better than ours, especially today. But, and here's the trick, just like the Faustian bargain is not all it's cracked up to be, and not what it seems to be initially, so the Faustinian bargain is not exactly this sacrificing now for later. This is not the right way to see things according to Faustina. Of course, obedience requires sacrificing of our wills, as we will see, but it is not an entirely negative or limiting thing. Quite the opposite. Obedience for St. Faustina is a matter of gaining something, not only then, but also now. It's a matter of gaining a relationship now with God in everything. Let's see. Although I think most people will think mercy is the most important virtue for St. Faustina, I tend to see obedience as taking the central place. I'm probably wrong about that. To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To a Kantian, everything looks like duty, I suppose. And the sisters will, of course, correct me in the Q&A later. But for now, let's just say that it is a very important virtue for her. And she uses the word all over the diary. Anyone's come across it. I'll focus just on her description of it, both the vow and virtue form, and then give some Faustinian examples of how it plays out. St. Faustina, during her novitiate, writes a short catechism of the vows as she's preparing to make. And they're definitions that come from the novice directress that she's writing down. She first defines a vow this way. A vow is a voluntary promise made to God to carry out a more perfect act. This leads to a distinction for her between vows and virtues. A vow pertains only to what is commanded under pain of sin. The virtue goes beyond this and helps in the carrying out of the vow. On the other hand, by breaking the vow, we fail in the virtue and do it damage. So the vows and virtues are connected, but the virtue is more embracing. Basically, a virtue is a capacity to carry out a vow. It is an internal principle or power to act more easily and promptly in accordance with the vows we make. An internalization of the vow, we might say. Faustina then turns to the three vows of religion, and we need only focus on obedience. She says the vow of obedience is superior to the first two, poverty and chastity. It is, to tell the truth, a holocaust, and it is more necessary because it forms and animates the monastic body. This is the definition. Specifically, the vow of obedience. By the vow of obedience, the religious promises to God to be obedient to his legitimate superiors in everything they will ordain in virtue of the rule. The vow of obedience makes the religious dependent on his superior in virtue of these rules for his whole life and in all of his affairs. And the virtue of obedience? The virtue of obedience goes further than the vow. It embraces the rules, the regulations, and even the counsels of the superiors. And finally, she cites St. Ignatius of Loyola, of all people, with some advice for living out the vow. To facilitate obedience, St. Ignatius suggests, moreover, three means. Always to see God in our superiors, whoever he might be. To justify in itself the order or advice of the superior. To accept each order as an order from God, without examining it or reflecting on it. That last one is just like a killer for Dominicans, but we'll leave it be. It's Ignatian. Okay. So the benefits, these is their vow and virtues of obedience. Let's just take obedience in the broad sense so that it applies to you in following your commands and not just us religious. So the virtue of obedience, you could say. That we all can practice this virtue of obedience and acts of obedience in our daily lives, as we are obedient people to people above us and events around us. Why in the world would anyone take this bargain? St. Faustina tells us herself, when she, interestingly enough, as sisters know, returns to the description of the vow of obedience later in her life, this time using her own words, no doubt won by hard experience, and I dare say a little stronger and better than the original catechism. But that's just a dig on the Jesuits. She says, I understand, O Jesus, the spirit of obedience, in what it consists. It includes not only external performance, but also the reason, the will, and the judgment. Obeying our superiors, we obey God. It makes no difference whether it is an angel or a man who, acting in God's stead, gives me orders. I must always obey. Obeying our superiors, we obey God. What positive thing does obedience in this way give to us? Why is it not merely, according to Faustina, a negation or limitation or a sacrifice? Because through obedience, we can make every action into a direct act of love to God. How so? Because, as St. Faustina says, obedience excludes not only external performance, but also the reason, will, and judgment. The act of obedience, when we obey, is not merely conforming to some rules. It is acting according to the rule as a command and will of God. It is, in the most profound sense, a sharing or uniting of wills with God's will. In obedience, our wills conform to His, no matter how big or small. And why would you call this an act of love, obedience? Because love, at its essentials, is not merely external performance. Flowers on Valentine's Day are not sufficient. But love is the union of wills, the sharing in the willing of the good for the other as the other, not for me. To love someone is to make their will your will. And this is what the act of obedience allows us to do with God, to unite our wills with His will, to love Him in the most essential of ways. That's why obedience is a holocaust, a whole offering of what makes you fundamentally you, your will. And obedience practiced either in act or in disposition, the willingness to will God's will, can make everything an act of uniting of wills. For nothing, I repeat, nothing happens in the world without the will of God. Therefore, acting in life as if what is happening is a command to you is making everything into an act of love to God. Obedience breaks down the wall of religious and non-religious events, the sacred and the secular, in our human lives. It allows us to impress what Faustina calls the seal of obedience on all of our actions. Following the decision of a superior can become not only a resigned choice, or a calculated risk, or a nice thing to do, to become an act to God, because it is sealed with the obedience to His will. I think of this all-embracing vision of obedience, this idea of it, as a sort of, I don't know, like those red lights that come on in 1980s Russian submarine movies, Hunt for Red October, those sort of things, when battle stations are called, right? I mean, everything remains the same. You're still in the sub. Sean Connery is still doing a poor Russian accent. Nothing's really changed, except that now everything is bathed in this cool red light. Everything is sealed with battle readiness. Obedience to me, the disposition, my willing of it, is the same. It doesn't change the externals around us, really, but it seals them with a sort of light, the light of Christ's obedience, perhaps, which now colors the entire act. I'm still doing my job, whatever it might be, but it is colored differently because it is for him. Let me give you some examples from Faustina before finishing of this. There's just three. I'll pick three at random here. Well, not at random, I love these ones, but you could pick plenty of them. And one example, Saint Faustina wants oh so much to assisted Mass. This is later in her life. But the doctor and superior have said to her no. And she writes, I become absorbed in prayer and said my penance. Then I suddenly saw the Lord, who said to me, my daughter, know that you give me greater glory by a single act of obedience than by long prayers and mortifications. She says, oh, how good it is to live under obedience, to live conscious of the fact that everything I do is pleasing to God. And those are connected. Her obedience to God is what makes them pleasing. And not because mere obedience, again, is for obedience' sake, because obedience is the uniting of the will of one to another, in the most supreme case, God. A second example, this is my second favorite, I suppose. The last one I'll give is my absolute favorite. Jesus tells Faustina that she is to go to her confessor again and tell him that she is a lowly instrument. It's kind of a simple claim, I suppose. Okay. And Faustina responds to Jesus. Now remember, she's talking to Jesus. And I said, Jesus, I can no longer do anything you command me to do, because my confessor has told me that all this is an illusion. This is before painting the image. That I am not allowed to obey any of your commands. I will do nothing that you will tell me to do. I am sorry, my Lord, but I am not allowed to do anything, and I must obey my confessor. Jesus, I most earnestly ask your pardon. You know how much I suffer because of this, but it can't be helped, Jesus. The confessor has forbidden me to follow your orders. So she's telling Jesus, hey, that Jesuit guy over there, he said you can't talk to you. So I'm going to listen to him and not you. And you'd think, if there's a time to lay the hammer on the Jesuits, here it is. But no. Jesus listened to my arguments and complaints with kindness and satisfaction. I thought the Lord's Jesus would be grievously offended. Who wouldn't? But on the contrary, he was pleased. Why? Because she was obedient to him. And finally, this is my favorite. I call it the crocheting for souls. Faustina says, this morning after completing my spiritual exercises, I began at once to crochet. I sensed a stillness in my heart. I sensed that Jesus was resting in it. That deep and sweet consciousness of God's presence prompted me to say to the Lord, O most holy Trinity, dwelling in my heart, I beg you, grant the grace of conversion to as many souls as the number of stitches that I will make today with this crochet hook. I've never prayed that. I don't ever think I will. But there it is. Then I heard these words in my soul. Jesus, my daughter, too great are your demands. No thank you, okay? Jesus, she says, you know that for you, it's a little time for a theology lesson. You know that for you it is easier to grant much rather than a little. That it is, he says, so. It is less difficult for me to grant a soul much rather than a little. But every conversion of a sinful soul demands sacrifice. So he's, okay, time for some sacrifice. She's offering crocheting, right? Okay. He did the cross thing. She's got the point. Well, here's Faustina. Well, Jesus, I offer you this wholehearted work of mine. This offering does not seem to me to be too small for such a great number of souls. Why not? You know, Jesus, that for 30 years you were saving souls by just this kind of work. What kind of work? And since holy obedience forbids me to perform great penances and mortifications, therefore I ask you, Lord, accept these mere nothings stamped with the seal of obedience as great things. Then I heard a voice in my soul, my dear daughter, I comply with your request. How does she have this relationship with Christ? That's at the end of her life. She spent a life of obedience to him, which is a life of love. And lovers do things for the beloved. A Faustinian bargain is the trading of spiritual and eternal benefits for material and earthly ones. So that's a Faustian bargain. But of course, as Faust learns, and anyone who takes that sort of bargain of giving up the spiritual for the merely material, those supposed benefits are nothing of the sort, and the loss is of all that is really important. But I haven't focused on that, spiritual eternal benefits bargains. Rather, I've been proposing the opposite. The Faustinian bargain of obedience, which initially looks like a denial of material and earthly benefits for spiritual and eternal ones, but as I hope you have seen, is nothing of that sort. We haven't talked about eternal rewards. Let's just assume them. Instead, we have seen that for Faustina, obedience becomes an act of love, here and now, a uniting of wills, ours and God's, which is potentially available, as she says, in everything, in so much as the seal of obedience can be attached to all our actions, especially for those of us who are religious. Now, of course, the virtue of obedience is no excuse to be a doormat, or a pushover, or the suffering of deep injustice, physical, emotional, or otherwise. Notice that St. Faustina's considered definition of obedience is, of course, that the spirit of obedience consists in not only external performance, but also the reason, the will, and judgment. Reason, will, and judgment. All three are involved in obedience, even if it is the act of will that ultimately drives it. But we have rational wills. We're not just creatures that desire things and run to them. We think about them and we consider them in light of our reason, since we are knowers and lovers, not merely lovers. So while all things can be taken under the seal of obedience, not all things ought to be, given circumstances and situations. Prudence, as always, is an important virtue, discerning the will of God, even in obedience. Nevertheless, obedience is not just accepting what we want to accept. That's how I tend to think about it. As is evident to anyone who has read St. Faustina's diary. If you're here tonight, I suspect that you either have, or you might be inclined to. And if you're not, you can ask me all the benefits about it in the Q&A. I'd be happy to convince you of reading the whole diary and how to do it, or a little help. Obedience becomes an act of love. As I read Faustina, and in fact, perhaps the act of love, since while mercy is the crucial attribute of God, according to Faustina, it is not our crucial attribute, or so I claim. And that I claim that according to Faustina herself. For in the end, what else is this most beautiful prayer of hers than a quintessentially Faustinian act of obedience? Jesus, I trust in you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.